And we're back. Phew! It's all been a little bit of a rush. And coming up over the next half an hour, I'm going to turn on the caption. We're going to be talking about detecting dementias. And I'm joined all the way from Australia by Professor Jane Alty and also by Dr. Coco Newton, who's joining us from UCL. Hello, both of you. Thank you very much for finding time to join.
Hi, Adam.
So Coco is a research fellow at University College London, and Jane is a professor of neurology and consultant neurologist at the University of Tasmania. But enough of that. Why don't you do proper introductions? Jane, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. As you can hear, I'm not Australian, so I'm
that's
from the...
confused me.
I've not picked up the accent at all.
You're from the Northwest.
I am indeed, yes. So I grew up around Preston and I studied at Cambridge. I did my training really across the UK. I spent a bit of time at Queen's Square and Manchester and Leeds, so all over. And then I worked as a neurologist in Leeds since 2013, really specialising largely in movement disorders, so particularly Parkinson's, which, as you know, has a high risk of dementia. So saw plenty of cases of dementia there. And then moved to Australia in 2019. And since then, I've been working largely in an academic role and largely in Alzheimer's. So sort of sidestepped from Parkinson's into Alzheimer's. But I do still run a Parkinson's and movement disorders clinic in Hobart. So I'm living in Tasmania now, a little island off the bottom of Australia. And
where the devils are.
Sorry,
where the devils live.
Correct. Yeah, good knowledge.
Really?
Yeah, so largely working at the university and a little bit of time at the hospital. So that's me.
And Coco.
Yeah, actually quite some overlap with you, Jane. I mean, I'm not from the Northwest, but I also studied at Cambridge and I currently work at Queen's Square. So my next stop is obviously Australia. So I did my PhD here, in Cambridge and I finished in September. And that was really looking at Alzheimer's disease, but specifically how can we detect it earlier, and what is the first cognitive change that people living with dementia will experience, and how can we detect it better? And so rather than looking at memory assessments, which is the current mainstay of all clinical assessments, we decided to go back to the science, look at actually where does the sort of pathology of the disease start in the brain, what does it do? As in what does that brain region do, and how can we test it? And so by doing that approach, we came up with the theory that actually the science is telling us that it actually should be navigation. So how you find your way around the environment, remembering where you left your keys, planning a route to go to a new place that you've not been to, that type of behavior should actually be the one to sort of decline first. And so we spent some time designing assessments and have a couple of studies now that have proof of concept for that. So the next step is, well, what do we do with this information and how do we translate that to the clinic? And that's what I'm doing in my postdoc. I'm working at UCL as part of the EDoN initiative. So it stands for Early Detection of Neurodegeneration. It's spearheaded by Alzheimer's Research UK, but it's also got some funding from Gates and a couple of other venture capital type initiatives, because they're all really united behind this vision of using technology and new information and new signs and new biomarkers to detect different dementia types early, so we can get interventions to patients earlier and have better outcomes.
Great. And so thank you very much, Coco. I mean, what you talked there about biomarkers. We talked a little bit about biomarkers earlier, and the hypothesis here is that navigation is, you're assuming that's, or hoping that that's one of the very, very earliest. Do you think that's going to be the first potential practical sign people would experience? Is that the thought?
Yeah, good question. That's what we believe. And so when we talk about navigation, it's quite a sort of, it's not a very intuitive thing to think about, because we take our ability to navigate for granted every day. I mean, every day everyone has to navigate, and not just humans, all animals that move have to be able to navigate. So that's really why it's such a fundamental behavior that actually we haven't really studied in detail enough before.
Thank you. And Jane, so let's come back to you. Tell us all about your work. And first of all, I'm fascinated. Did you specifically move from the UK to Australia for the job you're doing now?
I think it was one of the key factors. There was a large study that was just starting up in Tasmania called the Island Project, and that stands for the Island Study Linking Aging and Neurodegenerative Disease. And it's got some overlaps actually with EDoN, and it's really interesting hearing your work about regarding that, Coco. So the Island Project is a little bit of a play on words, because it is talking generally about aging and separating healthy aging from the earlier stages of neurodegenerative disease. But obviously it's also recognising that it's set in the island of Tasmania. So this is really a study that's trying to lower the prevalence of dementia in Tasmania. So Tasmania has the oldest demographics in Australia, and it has the highest rates of risk factors for dementia in Australia. So plenty of dementia in Tasmania. And this is a study that was set up by James Vickers at the University of Tasmania. And it's really taking those 12 modifiable risk factors of dementia that's reported in the Lancet Commission paper and saying, okay, let's educate people about those, because lots of people out in the community don't know about them. They still think that dementia is perhaps just inevitable and there's nothing you can do to prevent it. And it has a few different strands to it, but basically James set out to recruit about 10% of the Tasmanian population over the age of 50. So we aim to recruit 20,000 people, and so far we've recruited about 14,000. And about half of those people are actively involved in online research. So we show them educational videos about modifiable dementia risk factors, and we then look at the change in their behaviour and their knowledge and their attitudes towards that. And largely this is all done online, which is really handy, because in Tasmania, as well as having some cities, it has a lot of people that live rurally. And effectively, it's a large online study where people every year complete questionnaires and online cognitive tests and various other assessments. And then we're going to track them over 10 years and try and drive down the number of people that are developing dementia, or at least delay the onset. But within that study, because you've got such a large cohort, you then can have lots of sub-studies. So I'm particularly interested in technologies and really applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to this data and trying to detect what are those earliest patterns before somebody develops memory problems, and how can we really get to the very earliest pre-cognitive stages, particularly of Alzheimer's, and try and change the trajectory.
So this has got to be one of the best pairings that we've got, because it sounds from hearing Perfect. Both of your introductions there, you're both very much in that space. So when you talk about technologies, what are we talking about? Are these things that we already routinely use? Because I'd imagine if you can tap into things that people are already using, it's going to make it easier, right? Or are these new clever things that you're developing? Coco, why don't you? How would you?
Yeah, so the goal of EDoN is to make this as accessible as possible for anyone to take part in. And so what we're concentrating on at the moment is what do most people have at home already, and that tends to be a smartphone. I think about 80 to 90% of people have a smartphone in the West, and it's catching up in other countries as well, because of course we want this to be a global initiative. And so we're looking at apps that can track, for example, how you interact with your device, so your swiping speed, your typing speed, and also short bursts of cognitive tests that you could just do at home. You'll get a little notification saying time for you to do your tests, so we can collect data remotely that it just fits into people's lives instead of having to get people to come into the clinic. And then outside of smartphones, what we're also looking at is smart watches, so Fitbit type of watches that collect sort of general activity levels. And also what we've been looking at in EDoN has been something called the Dream headband, which is essentially a device that sort of fits on your head like this, a bit like a halo. But that tracks the brain activity as you sleep, because we know that sleep changes are very, very important, not necessarily as a cause of dementia, but maybe as an early indicator. And so that we've been piloting that in a few cohorts that are linked up with EDoN. And then the next sort of real sort of direction that I think digital devices are going are sensors that can track how we walk, our gait, because we know that there are very, very, very subtle changes in how even just the time you spend on each leg as you're walking, that might indicate that something is starting to decline, as Jane says, before even cognitive changes. So those type of devices that might form a wristband or sit in a little patch that you wear on or clip onto your belt or something, those are the type of devices that we're looking at.
Jane, is that the same stuff for you, or are you using anything different?
Well, lots of overlap and synergy there for sure. We at the moment are largely doing more, so I understand what Coco's saying, that a lot of that data is being collected passively in terms of people's everyday life. At the moment, we're not doing that. We're doing more set periods of testing. So we do our annual surveys, as I mentioned, where people fill in questionnaires, and then we also do annual cognitive tests using validated online tests such as CanTab, coming from Cambridge, but also some more exploratory tests. So I'm leading a team to develop something called TAS test or Tasmanian test. And there's a protocol paper that's freely accessible, but basically that's looking at all sorts of measurements, but particularly movement. So it's looking at movement of the hands, and it's looking at reaction time, clicks on the mouse, and visual perceptual reactions, looking at images and recognizing how quickly you can detect that. So, we're looking at similar sorts of measures, but probably in a slightly different way. We're bringing some people in for in-person tests. So Coco mentioned about gait, and it's well recognised that gait's changing at least 10 years before somebody develops memory symptoms with Alzheimer's. So we're bringing people in to walk them up and down what we call a gait mat, so that can detect people's precisely where they put their feet and precisely at what time. So you can extract all sorts of data from that. And then we're also bringing people in for sort of more standard pen and paper cognitive tests. So obviously we can't do that with everybody, but we're bringing some samples in some ways to validate our online tests as well, because largely what we're doing is an online study.
I guess many people watching might be surprised to know that you can, learn so much from how you walk or sleep patterns or from your smart watches and things like that. Are there any, because also as well, sometimes we were talking about ethics earlier, I can't help but think that we're sometimes a little bit overly worried about sharing our information. And I imagine that some of the practical challenges with this are, particularly for your work, Coco, is people's nervousness about, are they being spied upon, or are you collecting too much information? But whenever I talk to people, so many have been happy to say, "Go, you can take whatever you like." I'd quite happily give you whatever my Alexa, listening in to my Alexa or whatever my smartwatch takes. Are there any challenges with using some of these new digital technologies? What are the practical problems?
Absolutely. It's one of the key issues that we're facing as a research world, is what is appropriate data to be collecting for people, and what would happen if that data got into the wrong hands. So it's one of the things that we're focusing on really heavily at EDoN, and we have a working group that's just dedicated purely to sort of this privacy issue at the moment. And one thing that we're thinking about is, well, a lot of the raw data that's collected, aside from privacy issue, it's so much data, it's more than the servers at, Cambridge or other institutions could store. And so if we could compress that somehow, or just extract summary information from that raw data, then that would have a lot less storage. But also that means that it's a lot more anonymous, because essentially we're not tracking minute by minute information by people, but the device will be tracking the data. And then every few hours, an algorithm on the device can create a summary measure and send that summary measure So actually it becomes a lot more anonymized and not direct data from people, but just summary statistics. And so that's what we're looking at, but we're not quite there yet. It's one of our big jobs to do.
What about you, Jane? I mean, with so many people completing these regular tests, do you use it in the meantime? I mean, obviously you're passive, well, you know, proactively collecting this information from people of all different ages. If you spot something, or if you learn something like a lifestyle recommendation, for example, do you feed that back in? Actually, I'm guessing you can't. Would that spoil the study if you start saying, hey, you should, you know?
Yeah, great question. For the lifestyle, we are very open with that. So people complete our questionnaires and they almost get a complete real-time report to say, look, you're scoring high risk there, or medium risk, or low risk. And we have a sort of traffic light system. And people really like those reports, certainly the people that are taking part in the research, that they get a printout of their report at the end. They can discuss it with their, you know, friends or family, which is a great way to recruit more people in. And then also over time, hopefully, we start to see more of those red and orange boxes turn green as they're reducing their risk down. So for that, I think there isn't really hugely an ethical issue. You know, they've consented to take part in the research. They've been told, look, you're going to find out something about your risk, but there's something you can do about it. So for that, I think that's reasonably straightforward. I think the harder one is more around, we collect some blood biomarkers. So some people come in and give blood, where we can measure brain proteins such as amyloid and phosphorylated tau that we know are building up years before people develop Alzheimer's. And that brings with it many more ethical issues, really, because what do you do if you then detect a high level in someone that has no symptoms right now? Now, at the moment, we do not divulge that, and that's gone through an ethics committee. And the rationale behind that is that we're not quite sure how to interpret those blood results just yet. And although the FDA in America has licensed some of these tests, around the world, they're otherwise not licensed for clinical use. So they're very much being used as a research tool. But I recognise that this is a fast-moving area of research, and in the next few years, that's going to change. I think these tests will be coming into clinic, and then we do have a big ethical issue of people have given their blood. We know those results. Surely we should be informing people of those results, or at least giving them the opportunity. So it might be over time we have a re-consent where we say things have moved on. Do you want to know the results? Which is going to be a big discussion. And I think that's going to be an ethical issue that many studies around the world need to also think about. But it's the nature of the fact that research is, bringing these new breakthroughs, really.
But then it also as well, I guess this serves two purposes. Not only do you gather that longitudinal information that then kind of allows you to develop an intervention for the next generation or for the next batch of people who want to sign up, but I guess people who are participating in the study now will benefit rather than just collecting information, because I guess people are going to be different views on this, aren't they? Some are quite happy to give you their information, but others want they want something back. Give me something back in return for it, that'll actually help. So where's this taking us over the next 5 years? That's a big question, isn't it? Coco, where's this going to go? Where's EDoN going over the next 5 years?
Where's EDoN going?
Can anybody just join EDoN? Is this a thing that anybody can do?
So the way, in terms of general public, the way EDoN operates is that they work with several cohorts around the world. So you can very easily get involved with these cohorts through joint dementia research. And then that way we can connect you up and link you up to what we're doing at EDoN. In terms of researchers, we operate at all universities around the world, actually. So if there's a post opening, then just apply for it. We're a great team. Where EDoN is going, I mean, ultimately our sort of vision is that we enable primary care GPs to better detect people in the general population that are at risk for progressing to dementia, so we can find them and then hopefully give them the interventions that Jane's research will show are best at helping mitigate future dementia. So that's what we envisage. I think before that happens, we need to think about our health systems. I don't think, at least in the UK, the NHS is built up around, as Jane was saying, well, if we understand and we have more information about individuals, how do we communicate that to them in a way that empowers them with information and doesn't scare people, because that's a huge risk here. And how do we do it on people's terms, right? We can't just throw a load of information at people and say, oh, XYZ about you, all of these data points, do this, do that, and see you in 6 months. It's not going to work like that. So there's a massive job to do in terms of talking to clinicians, talking to the general public, talking to policymakers about this is how research is moving forward. How do we best implement it in a way that works best for everyone? And I'm really interested in that aspect of it as well. So if anyone's watching and is doing that research or would be interested to give their opinion, then please email me.
The benefits of that really are twofold, aren't they? Because not only are you gathering all this information that kind of helps us identify dementias at an earlier stage, that one of the reasons why we need that is not just to inform brain health programs and dementia prevention, but also so many of the treatments that are potentially on the horizon, like the one we've heard about this week. There's this thing called like personalised medicine, where there's a good chance that the treatments that we are going to be able to prescribe to people are going to be different treatments for very specific different people, and also as well at different stages. So having as much information as we can get on people will help ultimately, once treatments or combinations of treatments are available, to give those to the right people. Otherwise they won't work. Jane, what's your view? I mean, Ireland study is incredible. We should put a plug in for the MOOC as well. Is the MOOC open right now? Every time I hear James, we should get a plug in for the MOOC. The MOOC is amazing. Yeah. I love the MOOC. Yeah, this is a massive open online course.
Yes, that's right. So there's 2 MOOCs. There's Understanding Dementia, and then there's Preventing Dementia. And if you just Google them, they appear. And they're, as you know, the MOOC name means, are completely free.
Chats and let's see if I can find some links. While you're talking, I'm going to find links and post them in the chat.
Thank you, Adam. So they've been very well received, and people all over the world have done these, and they're always sort of rated in the top 10 MOOCs for health education. So I think they're really accessible. You know, you can. I've watched them and I've learned something from them. But equally, if you know nothing about dementia and you're just starting out, you can interact and learn from them. So yeah, I was just admiring Coco's response, really. I don't think I've got much more to add to that. You know, I think to give an analogy that I know has been used before, but I do think dementia is probably 20 years at least behind where cancer research was. And look what's happened with cancer. You know, we've now got screening programs that have just become part of normal health checks that have been largely accepted by the community. And it's become more normalized. You know, it's not the big C. People can talk about cancer. And there's been huge steps in terms of personalizing, as you said, Adam, treatments to the individual, and just recognizing, you know, not all cancers are the same. And it's absolutely the same with dementia. Even within what we would call Alzheimer's, there's lots of different subtypes. And I strongly believe that there will be individual treatments for those subtypes, and that's going to be the best way forward, really. But to detect that, we need to be detecting it much, much earlier than we are right now. And I think by that, I mean 10, 20 years earlier than we're detecting it right now, when people are coming to the cognitive clinic saying their memory is not so good. The pathology was starting at least 10 years before. And I think that's the time we really want to be detecting it.
And we know people wait, don't they? They bury their head in the sand. They kind of think, oh, I haven't got a problem. Don't wait, go get checked out. Thank you very much to Dr. Coco Newton and Professor Jane Alty from Tasmania and UCL. It's been fascinating. If you want more information on both Jane and Coco's work, if you'll find bios of them on our website at chatathon.uk. There's details of both their Twitters as well, and go give them a follow on Twitter. Thank you very much, both.
Thanks, Adam. It was great.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. So I believe our chatathon.uk /donate link should be working again. You might need to refresh your browser in case it's not refreshed, or if it's not working for you, open a new incognito window and put that in there, and it should work, as should the link from the chatathon.uk website. I know what's the problem is. The problem is that the old donation link had an expiry date on it, which was the date of the event rather than the date we wanted it to expire. However, luckily for me, we had this backup one at the charity. It's all still in the charities trust. All the money you give will still be donated to the 4 charities and equally distributed across them. It just means that I now have 2 websites to look at to work out how much we raised. But yeah, that should work for you now. chatathon.uk/donate. Coming up over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking about digital tools to help people living with dementia. So I think we're probably going to move on a little bit from the early stages of trying to gather information to predict and inform brain health, and move on to practical things you can do following diagnosis. But before we get to that, I'm going to give them a quick break, and I'm going to play you a quick video from one of our charities. This time we're going to hear from the Lewy Body Society.